Okay, for week 16 Thursday, we reflect upon these pages of the trial, which give us our defense and verdict. So on page 292, we begin and end in 90 minutes. So the defense is extremely short, not intentionally so, but objections by the prosecution led to cutting off a lot of testimony that otherwise may have happened. So Dick's father testifies about Dick's car accident, which is supposed to introduce the possibility that Dick's concussion, his brain injury during the car accident, may have led to his criminal behavior. Unfortunately, there's one little incident that seems to destroy that theory, and that is that Dick was arrested for breaking into a drugstore in 1949, and the car accident happened in 1950. So the opposing lawyer very effectively dismantles that argument and says, look, sorry, that there was some criminal behavior before then. There's no reason to think that he would have gotten better. Now, the next witness is very interesting. Not so much because what he says in the trial, that on the surface is very boring. He only gets a few words out. But what he would have said is very interesting. So Dr. Jones, a physician specializing in the field of psychiatry, remember, according to the Monotone rule, he's only allowed to answer 2 questions with a yes or a no. So, do you have an opinion as to whether or not he knew right from wrong at the time of the commission of the crime? A yes. And what is your opinion? So he said, I think that within the usual definitions, Mr. Hickok did know right from wrong. Okay. Now, his testimony gets cut off there, but he does elaborate later on what he would have said if he had been allowed to say it. And this is about middle of 294. So he mentions several things which have already been mentioned, Dick's car accident, the fact that he's above average in intelligence, his impulse control issues, talks about his issues with self-esteem at the top of 295, that he feels sexually inadequate, which may be why, he developed a sexual attraction to children. Maybe he feels less inadequate that way. But regardless, that sexual perversion, as disgusting as it is, does not make him temporarily insane. So Dick has been pronounced sane. So the next few witnesses are for Perry. Now, it's heartbreaking in some ways that they don't get to say more, not just for Perry's sake, but because some of them came so far. So Joe James, he traveled night and day to try and make it there to help out Perry, and he got out, like one whole sentence about him. And then there was an objection, He was a likable kid. He was a likable fellow. Don Cullivan, who came from multiple states away, that's about all he got to say. So because they gave an assessment of his personality, likable, rather than detailing a specific incident, that was why the objection, that got cut down there. So not pastor, priest, reverend. The reverend made it a little bit farther because he talked about Perry's portrait of Jesus Christ. Now, obviously, I'm sure that, evil criminal people are just as able to paint Jesus Christ as other people, but the reverend did oppose capital punishment and I suppose was hoping to persuade the jury that there was some good in him. Now, Dr. Jones gets real interesting here. The first question, do you have an opinion as to whether he knew right from wrong at the time of the offense involved in this action? No, I don't have an opinion. So Dr. Jones, in the time that he had to assess Perry, could not clearly and definitively state that Perry knew right from wrong. Now, obviously, he's cut off there, but the discourse that follows, both from Dr. Jones and then also from Dr. Satin, about this particular kind of mental, don't even know what to call it, mental issue that Perry has, is very interesting. So one thing that Dr. Jones mentions in his personality is his paranoid orientation towards the world. And we do see this from Perry's constantly suspicious of people, constantly suspects that people are out to get him or that they think badly about him. So that is one aspect of his personality. The other is his rage. Easily triggered, much more so than for the normal person. And that was something that Willie J had commented on, was his kind of disproportionate anger. So ultimately, if Dr. Jones had to give him like a informal, off the cuff kind of diagnosis, he displays personality similarities to a paranoid schizophrenic. He doesn't necessarily have the same level of delusions or hallucinations that a paranoid schizophrenic would, but his paranoid orientation and his belief that people are out to get him constitute enough for Dr. Jones to kind of tentatively lump him into that category. So the other very interesting incident is this article from Dr. Joseph Satin, and obviously this is not presented in the courtroom, but in examining the way that things happened, this murder without motive, it fits pretty well with Perry. So he has a lot in common with the men who are described in this article. They're rational, they're sane, but their murders are not rational and don't seem terribly sane. So there's a few details starting on 299 that I'm going to point out that Perry has in common with them. So the men who committed these crimes were puzzled as to why they killed their victims, who were relatively unknown to them, and in each instance the murderer appears to have lapsed into a dreamlike dissociative trance from which he awakened to suddenly discover himself assaulting his victims. So that is almost, a perfect way to describe what happened to Perry. He didn't seem to intend to kill the Clutters. He said that he was trying to call Dick's bluff. He obviously didn't know them before that night. And that blackout moment where he was kneeling in front of Mr. Clutter and suddenly he realized that Mr. Clutter was gurgling blood because he'd slit his throat. That is this dreamlike dissociative trance, only for a few seconds in Perry's case, but it was long enough for him to, hurt Mr. Clutter. The other things that are mentioned, history of erratic control over aggressive impulses. Perry has a history of aggression, poorly controlled rage and aggression. Another interesting thing that these men had in common were ego images of themselves as physically inferior, weak, and inadequate. Perry's legs and his very kind of short stature are something that are mentioned several times and reflect his poor self-esteem about himself. Sexual inhibition, we know that Perry hasn't had a lot of relationships. Cookie seems to be the only significant one. And obviously he was only able to bond with her because she was caring for him when he was ill. So that allowed him to see her as not as intimidating, perhaps. At the top of 300, continue talking about how they're concerned about being considered sissies or physically undersized or sickly, kind of overcompensate, but with aggression and rage and getting into fights a lot. In terms of family history, talks about a history of extreme parental violence during childhood. Now, Perry did not experience as much significant violence maybe from his actual parents, but the violence that he received as a child from, these authority figures in his life, the Catholic nuns and the people at the Salvation Army, definitely figure into the formation of his personality. Also talks about severe emotional deprivation in early life. So when Perry's mother started drinking, obviously he's probably not getting a lot of emotional needs fulfilled from his drunken mother who doesn't care about him. His father, they had an okay relationship when he was a kid, but then later on, he ended up being kind of rejected by his father. So chaotic family life followed by rejection. He's gone through periods of intense rage, but it does specify at the bottom of 300 that most of these men didn't actually feel anger or rage in association with their violent and aggressive action. Perry was not angry at Mr. Clutter when he slit his throat. He was ashamed of himself, but he was not angry at Mr. Clutter. He did not commit that murder out of anger, even though he has a history of anger and violence. At the top of 301, talks about how none of these men felt serious guilt, depression, and remorse. And that kind of fits in with what Perry said to Don Cullivan. Well, I'm sorry for myself, but I'm not real sorry about what I did, picking off targets in a shooting gallery. So with all of these things in mind, they feel pretty comfortable. Dr. Satin feels pretty comfortable in assigning Perry to this diagnosis, murder without motive. Very strange diagnosis in the early days of psychiatry. Okay, so anyways, the next section, we get the conclusion statements of the trial. We get the, what's the word I'm looking for? The final remarks by the lawyers. Now, there is one in particular, of course, who stands out from the rest. So there's 2 defense attorneys and 2 prosecuting attorneys. And Logan Green is certainly the star of the show. And I want you to notice, rhetorically speaking, some of the really significant things that he does in his final address to the jury. So at the bottom of page 303, that's when Green starts speaking. So, of course, you have these pathos-inducing statements. Well, it's a good thing these lawyers weren't there because they would have been dead. But I think one of the most effective things I see here, Logan Green understands a counter-argument. So I've been preaching to you guys, the whole semester about counter-arguments and how effective they are. Logan Green knew that the defense would use the Bible. And even though he could have just said, well, the Bible isn't relevant here, this is a secular case in our secular government, he could have dismissed it. But first, he used it against them. Oh, that's good. So these Bible verses that he chooses, he that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. And then whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. He is absolutely using the Bible to justify capital punishment here. So anyone who thought, from a religious perspective, well, thou shalt not kill, killing people's wrong, maybe we shouldn't give them capital punishment, he is eliminating the ability of that argument to stand. He then really piles on the pathos, talking about, and love this little syntax moment here. This is repetition, but for money. So he definitely knows how to effectively use rhetorical devices here. $10 a life, cheaply valuing the Clutters, who were such, of course, valuable citizens in the community. And then the things you can do in speeches, of course, that you can't do in written arguments, is you have so much to communicate non-verbally. His voice trembled, toppled, and disappeared, as though strangled by the intensity of his own loathing for the debonair, gum-chewing defendants. So, seeming emotionally overwhelmed, it's manipulating, sure, but it's effective, to see someone getting upset about something like that. It makes you as a jury member feel, oh gosh, I should be upset too. And then he challenges them, he dares them, he insults them. Do you want to be a pack of chicken-hearted jurors? Are you a coward? Are you afraid to sentence these men to get the death penalty? I dare you. So, very much a effective piece of rhetoric there in condemning these men. And, the conclusion is just as we suspected. Guilty, 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 guilty. And, Perry and Dick make a nice little joke on their way out, but of course they have a very serious situation facing them. Now, the last two little sections in this part are very short, but just some kind of somber after-trial reactions. So first we get Perry. Mrs. Meyer had to leave, and she feels so bad about leaving him all alone with his death sentence. Kind of a tough time. Saying goodbye, of course, was difficult. He didn't even want to speak to them, but he gave her this little picture when he was 16 years old. Before he was totally remorseless and rotten on the inside, I suppose. And then we get the detail about Perry's little squirrel. That squirrel of his. He sure misses Perry. Won't have anything to do with me. But so some sad farewells from the Meyers. And then a very kind of clinical description of prison in Kansas, specifically, of course, the one that houses death row. And I love the simile used in this section. Trying to find it, but yes, officially called the Segregation and Isolation Building, and it is a dark 2-storied building shaped like a coffin. How appropriate. Shaped like a coffin, because that's where a lot of the people who are housed there end up. Now, segregation also implies that it's used for solitary confinement, but it is used primarily as death row. So right now, the date that is set for the demise of the criminals, Friday, May 13th, 1960. Friday the 13th. Ironic.